Hello, welcome to the 19th century East Central Africa. Well, or welcome to my study when I'm talking about the 19th century East Central Africa. Um, this is going to be a show and tell. I'm going to obviously tell and talk, but I'll also show a number of images because actually I got to say your textbook, the read book, I think is pretty good on this topic. If anything, it's maybe too detailed. Richard Reed, East Africa, 19th century Central Africa was his specialty. The first research that he did, first research I did as well, actually, and I know him. Um, so that could be good or bad. The research focus, I mean, sometimes people focus on something they know a lot, then you get too much. Um, Anyway, yeah, I know him. I could tell you wacky stories. We were at this conference one time in Paris, out late drinking. It didn't end well for me. I'll just tell you that. He's Irish, and stereotypes aside, in this case, it's pretty much true. Drank me under the table. Anyway, so I do think the chapter here is pretty good. So I just want to talk about a few things and emphasize a few points, and then also spend a couple minutes talking about some of the stuff from the Sunseri article. All right, so we move along here as if it will let me. Um, what I want to also emphasize, what he mentions in here as well a little bit, are the differences between East Africa and West Africa. As we've spent about 3 weeks looking at West Africa now, we're in a position to do some compare and contrast. East Africa generally, especially for the interior, was less integrated into global trade than was West Africa, certainly up through the 18th century. If you look at this map, which is showing trade routes and so on in the East African interior, you basically have one. You basically have this one major trade route across what is today central Tanzania to Tabora and then on to Ujiji, and then a branch up toward and not really reaching these Great Lakes states. They're called interlacustrine in the lakes areas, including Buganda, which is what I and Reed both did our initial research on, and then another branch down toward Central Africa here. So this is what it looked like in the up to the end of the 18th century. Doesn't look, not looking very dynamic in comparison to this. This is what it looks like in the 19th century, right? Where we have that same central trade route from Zanzibar to Tabora on up to Buganda now, on across into Central Africa, not just to Ujiji, but across into what is today Congo. Another trade route out of Mombasa, another trade route from Zanzibar, cutting across the Rufiji River, and then from Kilwa down over here, and then trade routes from Mozambique, Angoche, and Kilimane, which were dominated by Portuguese down here into the East African and East Central African interior. So just looking at, once again from this to this, you just see how trade then is booming in the 19th century. And then as you'll read about and read, and once again also in the Sunseri article, the impact that's going to have on states and societies in the region. Okay. Now, a lot of this trade is going to be focused around slave trade. And demands for slaves from East Central Africa will take, 4 parts. First, starting in the late 18th century, you're going to have the development of sugar plantations in the Indian Ocean. These will be French and British. Right? So essentially that plantation system that we saw developing in the Caribbean is going to be transferred over to the Indian Ocean area. Okay. Secondly, especially after 1807, with the abolition of the Atlantic slave trade that we just were reading about, slave trade will continue on, especially to Cuba and Brazil, and some of those slave merchants will come over to the Indian Ocean to purchase slaves. In addition, there's an increasing slave trade to Southwest Asia. And then finally, or as they say, last but not least here, the establishment of plantations on the East African coast itself. All right. So all of these places are going to have economically speaking, a demand for slave labor, which will be at least partially met by slave exports from East Africa and East Central Africa. All right. And as Reed does, I said pretty well in the book, I think, showing you the impact of that. The fact that this comes when it does in the 19th century, it means it's also going to be different than West Africa, because the 19th century, as we'll come to see here, is going to be a time of significant firearm imports, which means we're going to see militarization of societies in East Africa, and not just states as we saw in West Africa, but basically armed gangs, militias, and so on. Militants roaming the countryside, enslaving and attacking people. So it's going to be a different profile than what we saw in West Africa. Okay. A lot of this then is going to be part of this Indian Ocean trade system. Once again, slave trade to offshore islands, to Southwest Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and Persia, and then we're going to have plantations established on the East African coast from Malindi down to Kilwa and Mozambique. So this whole stretch of what is going to become, what had been since about 1000 AD known as the Swahili coast. And that's what you see on this map, right? And the Swahili are coastal Muslims, all right? And yeah, intermixed with Persian and Arab immigrants. That's definitely true, but also definitely African. Now, what's going to change after the 1820s or so is the role of Omanis, and Reed talks about that. And Oman will basically establish an empire. Headquartered at Zanzibar here along the East African coast, and dominate the coast then, the Swahili coastline from the 1820s onward. And Zanzibar then will be the center of commerce. All goods coming from in and out of East Africa will pass through into and through the customs house at Zanzibar. And as I said, it's primarily going to be some Swahilis and Omanis who will establish plantations along the coast here. Okay. This is what the coast looks like. Beautiful white sand beaches, greenish blue ocean, palm trees, and so on. And it is actually beautiful. If you got a chance to go there, I certainly recommend it. A lot of the commerce that we'll be talking about is taking place via dhow transportation. Dhows are these small Indian ocean-going vessels. They can cross the Indian Ocean. They can go to Arabia and India and so on. But they're also small enough and have a shallow draft enough to hit all of the towns and ports along the coast. So they're kind of the ideal vessel for riding these monsoon wind systems around the Indian Ocean here. Now, one of the major, probably actually the major export we're going to have from the East African interior was ivory. And what you're going to see is a significant, and this just shows ivory imports into the UK, but from 1790 up to 1875. And you can see here how the numbers go from 100 tons a year up to 670 tons a year in less than a 100-year period. So trade increases 600%, six times, sixfold, whatever you want to say, during that time. And you can see also that significant parts of these peaks are due to ivory exports from East Africa. Okay, and that's what you see right here, especially later in the century. East Africa and East Africa are responsible for these peaks. Why ivory? Well, this is tied, as a lot of things we're going to talk about today, at least indirectly, with the growth of industrial capitalism in the UK and secondarily in the US, but starting in the UK. With the growth of industrial capitalism, you have the growth of what we will come to see as a middle class. And they're going to have they're going to have two things that they didn't have before: leisure time and disposable income. And they're going to use the disposable income to purchase decorative items for their homes, and then also in their leisure time. So we're going to see things like billiard balls. All right, these are made by the Brunswick Company, and if you can read the fine print here, it says, "We import the finest soft Zanzibar elephant tusk ivory." Okay, well, they're importing it from Zanzibar, but the ivory itself is coming from the East African interior, and it's being carried to Zanzibar once again as the center of all commerce in East Africa. So, anything at the time that we would nowadays make out of plastic, they didn't have plastics then. You have to use natural products, including ivory. Okay, and that's what these are. So these are billiard balls made out of ivory. In addition, decorative items like ivory handled silverware, as you see here. Ivory was used on inlays in various things, like this footstool. You'll see mirrors with ebony frames and ivory inlays around them and so on. All of which then is driving the commerce for ivory. Now, of course, the only way to get ivory is to kill elephants and cut their tusks off, and then generally hire individuals like these, porters, to carry that tusk of ivory to the coast. And those tusks of ivory from East Africa could be 50, 60, 70 pounds, okay? And you either balance it on your head like this or on your shoulder, okay? And then you strap other things to it, like your water jug and some of the things you're carrying and some food and stuff like that. And you start walking, maybe 8, 10, 12 miles a day for, well, I'll show you actually. I did some interviews I'll talk about in a few minutes with, where is it here? There we go. With some people living in this area right here, Liwale. And from there, it was 10 days to carry items to Kilwa. Right? And then from Kilwa, it was on to Zanzibar, because everything goes through Zanzibar. Anyway, so we see this is happening up through the later 19th century, late enough that we have photographs, we have pictures, like including this, showing a caravan stopping in a river. I don't know why they would stop in the river unless, other than somebody told them to stop and take a picture. But you can see the size of some of these ivory tusks. They're quite large and therefore heavy. Same thing here, except obviously this is a drawing instead of a photograph. But we can see that throughout the region then. And Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa are going to be major places for long distance trade. Okay, well, we see it here. Once again, these long distance routes. We've got 3 of them that terminate at Kilwa. But once again, everything that's going to Kilwa then goes on to Zanzibar, because it's all controlled by, after the 1820s, by the Omanis. All right. Okay. One of the other major exports from here are cloves. And if you're not familiar with cloves, they're used in especially Indian or South Asian cooking. It's a spice, and you find them in chai tea, in various spice mixes and so on. The major thing that we do with them in the West is put them in ham, okay? But it's going to be cloves, which are going to be the major item, which are grown on those plantations that I said the Omanis are establishing along the East African coast. What cloves are the unopened flower buds from these trees. Right? And they have to be unopened so they retain their aroma and the fragrance. So what you have are situations, certainly in the 19th century, with enslaved laborers, and especially women and children, climbing up on these scaffolds into these trees, picking all of these off. And you have to pick them right before they ripen. If you wait till after they ripen and they open up, then they're ruined. So it means going over these trees over and over and over again to get all of the buds at their peak, which is just before they open up, and then laying them out on these woven mats so they can dry. And this is the island of Pemba, which is just north of Zanzibar, showing how that's still done through into the 21st century. Anyway, so major exports from East Africa are going to be ivory, cloves, and of course, slaves, captive labor, generally in exchange for a small number of imported goods. Could be beads, wire, and so on. But the number one item is going to be cloth. And by the middle of the 19th century, you have a very distinct ivory cloth trade going on. So this is data from 1864, for example. Ivory is selling for, these are Maria Theresa silver dollars, 45 silver dollars for 35 pounds. Cloth then is selling for 2.33 silver dollars per 30 yards. Okay? And this is a particular kind of cloth which is known as Merikani. And that's the Swahili word for American. It's American cloth from mills in New England, northeastern United States, specifically from Lowell, Massachusetts. And 6 feet of cloth then sells for 25 cents at the coast, but obviously because of transport costs and so on, $1 in the interior. Okay, so cloth is going to be driving, cloth imports will be driving a lot of this trade, and you'll read about that in the Sunseri article. Okay, now the other thing you'll read about in the Sunseri article is another export from the coast here, which during major part of the 19th century actually was the number 2 export, and that's gum copal. Sunseri will give you all sorts of details about that, but it's the resin or gum from a particular type of tree. And it becomes very important as an export here, as we'll see here. By 1845, 1.5 million pounds will be exported in just 1 year. 42% of that is going to the United States, mostly in exchange for American cloth. Okay? Why gum copal? Well, as I said, Sunseri will give you more information, but the U.S. is also industrializing, and you have these middle and upper classes then who want to display their wealth, as middle and upper class people do, right? Got to buy a Lamborghini or whatever. But in the 19th century, what you did was you bought a horse-drawn carriage. And you see how shiny the exterior of this carriage is? Because this carriage is made out of wood and it's painted, but then you have to varnish the outside to protect it. And that varnish is made out of gum copal. Once again, like ivory, we don't have the glories of organic chemistry yet. Everything is made out of natural products, and it's made out of gum from East Africa, shipped on ships from Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and shipped over to Rhode Island, where there's a factory that makes this gum copal based varnish. Okay, and this is coming from areas of, well, Sunseri tell you the coastal forest areas of Tanzania here. Okay, and as I said, in exchange for cloth. How much cloth? Well, in 1856, U.S. cloth brought to Zanzibar 6,950 bales, each bale 750 yards, 5.2 million yards of cloth. That's in 1 year just from the United States. Okay? And in 2006 dollars, that comes to about $10 million worth of cloth. Okay? In exchange for ivory and gum copal. Okay? This is what Sunseri is talking about. These are the coastal forests where the gum copal is coming from. Kazumzumbwi and Pugu forests are very important along the coast there. And they're in Bwara, and it's important also because I have some pictures of them. Gum copal, well, here, let me tell you what happened here is in 2005, I was doing a project on forests and forest products in Tanzania, and Sunseri was doing a similar project focusing on gum copal. I was focusing on beeswax. Anyway, so we decided to do research together. We traveled together to Tanzania and visited these forests. along the coast and in the interior and interviewed people. He about gum copal, I about beeswax. Anyway, and then each published articles about that. Which means, though, I was along with him when he was doing this research, and that's why I have pictures of everything that he was talking about, including the Mnangu or Msandarusi tree. This is the tree that produces gum copal. Okay? One of the coastal forests he talks about is Chitope, and this is the view on top of one of the hills. You can see these are rolling hills, big hills / small mountains here. Let me see if it has the Chitope forest on this map somewhere. No, because it's one of the ones that's not in the pulled out here. It's actually about right here. Anyway, so it's not on that map. But this is what the coastal forests look like. Here's the Pugu forest. That is on one of the maps, and he talks about that. Let me see. Where's the Pugu forest? Right here. Okay, you see the Pugu forest here outside what is today Dar es Salaam. And here's a view of that forest then. It's a classic problem. You can't see the forest for the trees. It's hard to see it here. But that's what these forests look like. And they're very, very dense, a lot of vines and so on, and hard to get through. This is one of the road we had to take when we went from Kilwa to Lawale, where we interviewed people in the interior here, just to get a sense of what transport is like in the area. The answer is slow and difficult. Anyway, as I said then, the major exports from East Africa globally then are going to be ivory and gum copal through the 19th century in exchange for cloth, especially cloth from Lowell, Massachusetts. And this is the interior of one of those mills. And you probably, if you remember or not, but you studied this in U.S. history. I'm sure you did. This is the site of early industrial manufacturing in the United States, was textile manufacturing in Lowell, Massachusetts, established in 1814. And this is what the factory looks like with housing and so on here for the workers, primarily young women. Well, as you can see here, here's women working at these looms and mills then inside the mill. In this case, taking the spun thread and weaving it into cloth. All right. Now, one of the other major imports was guns, as I mentioned earlier, and Reed talks about this, which is going to result in a lot of violence in the East African interior. So that's another difference from West Africa. East Africa is going to be a lot more violent, and it's going to be fueled by this gun trade. In 1859, in 1 year here, 24,000 muskets imported to Zanzibar. U.S. traders alone brought 8,000 plus 11,000 barrels of powder, with other traders then obviously bringing in 16,000. And that's just going to increase by 1888, just in first 7 months of the year, 37,000 firearms, 1 million bullets, 70,000 pounds of powder. Okay, tens of thousands of guns flooding into East Africa at this time. Think about that when you read the textbook, okay, or review the textbook. And that's what he's going to talk about. And the Sunseri article, he's going to talk about people protecting these copal diggings with guns. And this is a drawing of one of these people, a Yao slave raider or trader. This is from East Central Africa region. And we have one of these militia leaders, Mlozi, and his followers. But look, each one of these young men standing behind him is holding a gun, okay? And these actually, it's interesting, these are actually carbines. So this is later 19th century. This is maybe the 1880s. You can tell because these are shorter guns. So either percussion cap or flintlock guns here. But that's what's going to fuel this violence in exchange for ivory and gum copal from the interior. Okay, that's where we're going to stop here. And thank you for paying attention. See you later.